Good evening, everyone. If you could go ahead and start making your way to your seats, we're about to ready to get started.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Courtney Penner. I am City Councillor for Ward 11 and a Calgary Public Library Board member. As we begin our program tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we are on with gratitude, respect, and reciprocity, acknowledging the ancestral home, the cultural, and the oral teachings of the Treaty 7 signatories, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai nations. The Itka Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Good Stoney Bands, the Wesley, and the people of Tsuut'ina. We also recognize the Métis people of Alberta Region 3, who call Treaty 7 their home, and all urban Indigenous and Inuit who also make this their home and their communities. At the library, we celebrate stories, and the stories of community of the land that we live on, and the stories of those who come and visit us. We respect all people who share and celebrate and care for the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta, and we honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us. And we recognize that we have a shared responsibility going forward to bring everyone together on the journey of truth and reconciliation. The speaker tonight is Ben M. Freeman, a Jewish leader, thinker, and educator. Born in Scotland, Ben is gay, Jewish, internationally renowned author, educator, diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist focusing on Jewish identity, combating Jew hatred, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. He's the founder of Modern Jewish Pride Movement, the author of the Jewish Pride Manifesto, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. The second book in his Jewish Pride trilogy, Jewish Pride, Reclaiming Our Story, was just released in October 22. And the final of Ben's trilogy will be released in 2024. I'm looking at Ben. I got to make remarks earlier today, and I got to come a little early tonight and spend time with Ben tonight, and I can tell you, you are all going to be absolutely delighted. The smile that he has on his face is authentic and genuine, and his care and charisma for the work that he's going to talk to you about tonight will truly, truly touch your hearts. And so, as he aims to educate, inspire, and empower both Jewish and non-Jewish people from all over the world, we need to give thanks to those who have brought Ben here with us tonight. The program tonight is made possible through a unique partnership with the Calgary Jewish Federation's Holocaust and Human Rights, Commemoration and Education Department, the Edmonton Public Library, the Jewish Federation of Edmonton, as well as the generous sponsorship by the Isadore and Florence Burstyn Memorial Fund for Human Rights and Holocaust Awareness, KSW Calgary Holocaust Education and Commemoration Endowment Fund, the Viewpoint Foundation, and the Human Rights Holocaust Education Fund at the Calgary Public Library Foundation. Joining Ben on stage are two wonderful community leaders. The program tonight will be moderated by Dahlia Libin and Marnie Bondar, co-chairs of the Calgary Jewish Federation's Holocaust and Human Rights Commemoration and Education Department. I am so glad that you have not made an acronym of that, because I think it is so important to say those words, to say what you are talking about, and to say the history and the future that we share simultaneously. So thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of you for joining, both in person and online. And now I will turn it over to Dahlia and Marnie to take the stage. And I apologize, I have another event, so I'm going to sneak as quietly as I can up the stairs.
Thank you so much. I'm Dahlia Libin, and this beautiful woman over here is Marnie Bondar. We want to thank all of you, both virtual and our live in-studio audience, for joining tonight. We know the weather is so beautiful out, so getting dressed to come out here, we know what that takes. So we really appreciate it. We are absolutely in for a special evening. Marnie and I could not be more thrilled to be sitting here with Ben M. Freeman. We started following him, reading his books, and becoming familiar with him a couple years ago. It has developed into a wonderful friendship. He's an incredibly bright and well-read expert in what he does. We turn to him frequently when we're dealing with issues of anti-Semitism within our city, questions about how to handle situations, and he is a delight. That is a wonderful way to describe you. I don't want to take up any more of your time. We're going to start having a conversation with him. There will be time for questions following. It's a little bit different how questions are going to run. For those online, please type in your questions in the chat section. We will then be able to pull them up on the iPad that we have here. For our in-studio audience, there's a QR code. Please scan that with your own devices, and that will give you a tab to type in your questions, and they'll pop up here for us when we run our question and answer period. So we'll get started. I guess just to kick things off, Ben, you have had a tremendous journey over the last few years to get to where you are. Can you talk to us a little bit about kind of who you are and how you got here?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. My name is Ben, and I'm from Glasgow in Scotland. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not Canadian. And I grew up in a very kind of active Jewish home. And I think there's a thing about Jewish people that when it's slightly harder to be Jewish, we're slightly more committed to our Jewishness. So in Glasgow, it was really more challenging to be Jewish. There was one Jewish elementary school, which is where I went. There was no Jewish high school. So my parents put a huge amount of effort into that. So with regards to my Jewish identity, it's always been one of pride and one of really being rooted into it. I understood what it meant to be Jewish from a very early age. I'm also now a proud gay man, but that was not always the case. And I was born in 1987, so I'm 35. And I was born at really during the AIDS epidemic, and that was the shadow which loomed over my coming out experience. So the lessons that we were taught with regards to LGBTQ plus people was that we were not able to be happy or successful or to have partnerships or to be whole, and that is really what I internalized. I had internalized those views from the world around me. And importantly, my family were not homophobic. The homophobes were not the people in my actual life. It was the general society. You know, in Britain until I was 10, it was illegal to talk about homosexuality in schools. So that is the context in which I grew up. So when I learned or realized or came to my sexual orientation, it was not something that I embraced at all. And I was with one of my closest friends who lives in Toronto, and I've known him for like 30 plus years. And I'm quite a chipper person. I'm kind of fun, I think. But during that period, I became someone totally different. Like my personality flipped because I felt such incredible shame. And it clouded really my teenage years, and it was a very difficult experience. But I had a realization, maybe when I was like 16 or 17, and the realization came with anger. I was really angry that I felt so miserable because I realized that I was being punished for a crime I hadn't committed. I had done nothing wrong. I happened to be a gay boy living in Glasgow, and that was it. But I was made to feel like I'd done something really wrong. And that realization was not the end of it. You know, I'm sure we'll talk about trauma. These things stay with you. But it was the beginning of a journey that led me to reject kind of heterosexual ideas about what it meant to be a gay person. So it meant that I, as a gay man, was able to define my own identity and my own experience. And I was not allowing any longer, I started the journey of not allowing any longer the wider world to tell me what it meant to be gay.
Wow.
Did you find, Ben, that that actually exists for other communities, not just the, our gay population, where you find that we internalize those other views that are maybe foisted upon us by others?
Absolutely. I think that it's a human phenomenon. And there's a book that was published in 1930 called Jüdischer Selfhass, which is Jewish self-hate. That's like really the extent of my German, so don't get excited. And this book, which is very specifically about the Jewish experience, says this is an experience of the whole human race. It's very prevalent in the LGBTQ plus community, and we talk about it. You know, we talk about ideas of how the wider world makes us feel and how we are rejecting those ideas or not. And also we see in the black community, there has been an incredible amount of really important academic work done with regards to internalized anti-black racism. And we see that there are black academics who define internalized anti-black racism as one of the three main manifestations of anti-black racism, which is really profound, because what we're seeing is there is an understanding in other communities about this experience. But in the Jewish community, we see something very strange. We see people describe it as rare, or we see people describe it as a myth. It's not a myth. It impacts every minoritized community. And, you know, at one point you have to ask, well, what makes us so special? Like, we're the only ones who don't experience this version of this phenomenon? Like, no, of course not. It affects every minoritized communities. But again, particularly the black community, the LGBTQ plus community, and many, many others, including, of course, the Jewish community.
So at what point did you start to realize your own internalized anti-Semitism and that it was not just you, it existed within others in the community?
Yeah, this makes me sound like a really sad person. I promise I'm chipper. You know, I used to say stuff like, I'm Jewish, but. I'm Zionist, but. And I was very proudly Jewish. My brother was in the IDF for 10 years. He is married to an Israeli woman. My sister made Aliyah, moved to Israel. She's married to an Israeli man. They have Israeli children. I worked for a Jewish organization. And this is the complicated thing about identity. It's very easy to think, oh, someone who suffers from internalized whatever would reject the thing that they are kind of trying to get away from, right? That a gay person would totally reject ideas of what it means to be gay or living a gay life because of internalized homophobia. And it's not the case necessarily. It's very complicated. I was working for a Jewish organization and defending Jews on campus at Glasgow University, which was a horrendous experience. But I was still wanting to be a good Jew. So I was happy being Jewish, but I wanted my non-Jewish friends and the people around me to understand that I was palatable. And, you know, I'm Jewish, but. And I would even say I'm a Zionist, but. And those are ideas that I totally have rejected now. But in my work, being online, it has made me realize that this is a very prevalent thing. And I have a chapter about this subject in my first book, Jewish, I almost forgot the name of it, Jewish Pride Rebuilding a People. That's a not so shameless plug. But I speak about it in the most extreme way. And I did hundreds of events with you guys all over the world. And people kept asking about this chapter. And then people wrote to me on social media and said, you know, this book, Jewish Pride, helped me get over my own internalized anti-Jewishness. And I was like, this is a bigger story here. It's not just, you know, anti-Zionist Jews or Jews from different parts of our history. This is something which can affect every Jewish person, even if they identify as a proud Jew. And there might be some Jews who say, well, this isn't my problem at all. And I think that's amazing, and I think that's very rare. But I think it could happen. But I think many of us, we have to look inside ourselves and think, well, how do we feel about our Jewishness, particularly when it means, you know, interacting with the wider world?
Have you ever experienced internalized Jew hate? And can you give us some examples of what that is? And at the same time, if we may also ask, maybe that's a term that we need you to define as well. What the heck is Jew hate?
So I'll start with the second part of the question. This is a phenomenon which is traditionally referred to as self-hate. And I reject that terminology. And I think there are some Jews who hate themselves, there are some gay people who hate themselves, but again, it's much more complicated. And there are so many different manifestations, which I know we'll talk about soon, so I won't get into them. But if you have a variety of manifestations, you then have to think about, okay, what causes it? What's the commonality? And I believe the commonality is when we absorb non-Jewish definitions of Jewish experience and allow the non-Jewish world to define our narrative. So there are definitely times that I've experienced that. I already mentioned saying I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but my first boyfriend, who shall remain nameless, he's a bit like Voldemort, he was a racist. He didn't like Jewish people. And I stayed in that relationship for just over a year. And what I did was I made my Jewishness smaller. You know, I, as I said, didn't think I was ever going to be in a happy relationship as a gay man. So I found this guy, and I was 23, and it was very romantic, and he was a poet. So that was alluring. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just make my Jewishness smaller. When we spoke about Israel, I would not maybe defend it as much as possible. I wouldn't discuss it. And I stayed. I mean, he said to me towards the end of our relationship that he could never marry me, which is obviously not something you want to hear from your partner. And the reason was because he could never have Israel in his life. Because my brother lived in Israel, my sister lived in Israel. And then I want to say something, because I don't like him at all, so I don't have any loyalty to this guy anymore. He then moved to China. After we broke up, he moved to China. I mean, I know I lived in Hong Kong, but he moved to China proper. It's crazy. You know, he was saying these things about Israel, that Israel was the worst country in the world, and then moved to China. And I'm no longer there, so I can say the human rights abuses that China is committing. And I made my Jewishness smaller. And that is a major example of this. I just didn't prioritize it. I was like, okay, well, it doesn't matter so much because this is my priority.
So why does this happen? I know in your book you talk about the broken mirror, kind of our self-blame. So what are we internalizing?
So we're a minority. And I think that sometimes we forget that, particularly in, you know, I was just in LA and New York, and I think it's easy for Jews in those kind of cities to forget that we're a minority. We're a global minority. And even within the state of Israel, of course, there's a Jewish majority there, but you zoom out and the region is not majority Jewish. And of course, you zoom out in the world. I mean, there's 15 million Jews in the world, and I think we're about to reach 8 billion people. That's like happened. I saw that in the news. And my math is terrible, so I don't know what percentage that is. So what happens when we're a minority is that there is a power dynamic between us and the wider world. So I'll talk about being British. So in Britain, we say prayers for the royal family every Shabbat. Yeah. And at weddings and bar mitzvahs, we say a prayer for the President of the State of Israel and the Queen, now I guess the King. So we're trying very hard to be accepted. And there is a power dynamic here because we're not in the majority. We actually don't really have any power. So what we see is the wider world, the non-Jewish world, which doesn't mean individual non-Jewish people. We have to remember this is much bigger than individual Jew or non-Jew. But we see this in this world that the wider world feels comfortable telling us what we are and imposing perceptions of palatable Jewishness onto us. So the idea that we're just a religious community, that's very prevalent in the West. You know, and I know we'll touch on that, so I won't go into it too much. But, you know, that is an idea that was imposed onto us. And what we do is we accept it because that is the perception, that's the reflection we're given. So this is what it means to be a palatable Jew. So that's what we see. Okay, then we want to be palatable Jews, and then we conform. We make ourselves smaller, we bastardize ourselves, and it really is why we have to reject non-Jewish definitions of Jewish experience and identity. Because they're not always coming from a, you know, nefarious place, but they're not Jews. So kind of by definition, they will not have an understanding of what it means to be a Jew, of our experiences, of trauma we may have, of the joys we may have, of the specificity of our experience. And that is the major problem. And I believe actually it's inherently hard for Jews to integrate into the Western world. And we can. I mean, we're in Calgary, I'm from the UK, I've integrated into British society, but because the world we're trying to integrate into was built, at least in part, in opposition to Jews, through kind of the origins of Western ideology, it becomes very complicated. So it's not just the power dynamic, it's also that the worlds we're trying to live in are, at least on some level, ideologically anti-Jewish. And that's not to say the whole world hates us, it's not to say we're victims, we're not victims, the whole world does not hate us. But there is something there. There are roots of this hatred which go deep, deep into the Western ideology and other ideologies. And that makes it very difficult for us to live authentically in these spaces.
How do you think Jew hate has evolved since time immemorial?
So there is an answer to that, and I'm going to speak about the Western experience because there is a kind of Eastern experience with regards to Islam. But if we look at the Western world, I believe it really goes back to Christianity. Because if we have to remember, how did Christianity originate? The early Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. And they had to then kind of at some point when the parting of the ways happened, they had to then say, okay, why we're no longer Jews. So you have a marketing exercise, which makes total sense. So they said, okay, the Jews are going to keep kosher, we're not going to do that. The Jews are going to circumcise, we're not going to do that. So we see this parting of the ways. But this created this theological trend to define Christian identity against Jews. And not just Christian, it became Western European. So for example, Karl Marx in the 19th century said, when a Christian becomes capitalist, he becomes a Jew. So he's using this ideas of Jews. Doesn't really have anything to do with us as real Jews, but ideas of Jews to define his understanding of the world. And then it took on a very nefarious, or a more nefarious, darker tone when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. Because who killed Jesus? It was the Romans. But then about 350 years later, they were now praising the man that they had murdered to be their Lord and God. So they had to find a new culprit, a new scapegoat. And that embedded this idea that Jews are a specific evil. Because to Christianity, Jesus is holy and pure and good and is a god. And if Jews could do something so awful as to murder him, then what else could we do? So we can kill children, right? Or we can control the world. Or we can steal money. We can do any of these things. And in the Western world, those are the roots, I believe, of Jew hatred. And again, it's the roots. And some people do come along and they try to chop off the bit at the top. And it doesn't work because the roots are still there.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw with Kanye West coming out with essentially what you're just describing. And, you know, many people are hearing it potentially for the first time thinking, oh, these are new ideas, and they're not. And there's nothing unique about it. So just getting back to the internalized experience, racism, the internalized anti-Semitism, can you share with us some more examples of the manifestations?
So I have identified 3 main manifestations. So now I need to remember them. Diminishment, denial, and deployment. Diminishment is, I think, what many Jews experience. It's the making our Jewishness smaller. So examples of that would be Jews not understanding that we're allowed to advocate for ourselves, that we're allowed to center ourselves. So for example, there was a British Jewish left-wing actor called David Schneider who tweeted just before the 2019 British general election, which Jeremy Corbyn was standing in. And Jeremy Corbyn is kind of the infamous, at this point, former leader of the Labour Party, who is a Jew hater. I mean, he really hates Jewish people. And David Schneider, a Jewish actor, said, you know, Corbyn is not good for the Jews, but he's the man to get these policies passed. And actually, there were Jews in 1933 in Germany who said the same thing about the Nazis. Because we're taught, if we stand up for ourselves, we're betraying universal values. So we don't stand up for ourselves. We change our names. You know, my mum's maiden name is Samuels. That was Shmulevitz. Her father, my grandpa David, he changed that name in Scotland in the 1930s. He was born in Scotland. So this was not being changed at the port, right? This was a decision, my grandfather made a decision as an adult to change his name, to make it more Anglified. Because we're trying to fit in, we're trying to make ourselves smaller. And I'm not sitting here with any judgment on my grandfather or anyone else, because it makes sense. When you understand the horrendous experiences that Jews have had, it's a survival technique. But the problem is that it never works. Then we go to denial, that kind of does what it says in the tin, you deny your Jewishness. So historically, this was Jews converting to other religions. Today, you can just say, I'm no longer a Jew. And in the book, I write about Ella Emhoff, who is Vice President Kamala Harris's stepdaughter, who her father is Jewish. So ancestrally speaking, she's half Jewish. I would define her as a Jew because I see patrilineal Jews as just as Jewish as those with Jewish mothers. And she was asked to be in a newspaper, and she said, "Oh, I'm not Jewish because I don't celebrate the faith." And that's a whole other misunderstanding, right? And then the last one is deployment. And it's when Jews deploy their Jewishness as a weapon. And we've seen this throughout history. It's not enough for a Jew to say, I'm an anti-Zionist. It wasn't enough in the Middle Ages for Jews to say, I'm a Christian. They then had to spend the rest of their lives demonizing the rest of the Jewish community. Because it wasn't really anymore about being a good Jew or a bad Jew. Any Jew was bad, and they had to show how good they were by being a good Christian. So before, the path of redemption was the path of Christ, and probably in a modern leftist context, the path of redemption is the path of anti-Zionism. And we see the same thing. We see Jews disavow Zionism, which is, I know we'll talk about this, which is central to the Jewish experience, in a bid to be accepted. And I will just tell you a very quick story. There was a British left-wing Jewish anti-Zionist activist, I guess, and he was in conversation with someone from the left, and he was saying, you don't hate Jews, right? You just hate anti-Zionists. And the guy's like, no, we hate Jews. And you see the color drain from this anti-Zionist Jew's face, because that's what people really believe. If I just do a little more, if I just disavow Israel more intensely, if I just conform to these societal expectations, then I will be saved. And it never works.
If I can just add on, can you talk about what Zionism is?
Sure, I'll have a sip later. It's too hot to sip, it might burn my throat. So Zionism is the movement of self-determination to return the Jews to their indigenous land, the land of Israel. And I've got to say, this is not something I will debate. That is what it is. It was a Jewish concept created by Jews for Jews. And of course, within that, as we know with the Jewish people, there are many different interpretations. But at its core, that's what it was. And what's more, although it came about in the 19th century, kind of as a response to rising Jew hatred, to the ideas of the modern nation state, it is rooted in the Jewish experience. I'm not going to sing it, because I did sing earlier, but I'm not going to sing it. But by the rivers of Babylon, there we wept when we remembered Zion from 2,500 years ago is an expression of Zionism. It is an expression of yearning for Jews to return to our indigenous land. L'shana haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. That's what we say during Pesach, Passover. That is another Zionist expression. And Jews from all over the Jewish world, from Ethiopia, from Poland, from Tunisia, all at different times, made effort to return. Not just because of the experience in those countries was often so awful, but it is because that is our indigenous land. And, you know, we're here in Canada, and I think Canada has a much more developed understanding of indigeneity than certainly the UK does. I mean, in UK, I don't think people really have a cultural understanding of it. But if we understand the connection that Indigenous communities here have to the land, there are similarities in our connections to our land. And earlier we had a representative from an Indigenous community who was nodding and writing things down that I was saying, and she said to me, this resonated with me so much. So that is what Zionism is. And anti-Zionism sometimes masquerades as criticism of Israel. It is not criticism of Israel. It is the delegitimization of the Jewish state. It is the demonization of the Jewish state. And it is the treating of Israel with double standards. And it is a form of Jew hatred. And that is, I mean, really, I've not come all the way to Calgary to debate that.
I want to take you back a little bit to trauma that we were talking about a little bit earlier. The way the book is set up is you teach for a big part of the first chunk of the book. And then the second part really allows you to talk to people who've had to deal with internalized Jew hate and figure out what their response was. And the one that resonated the most with me was the story of Roisin. Yeah, Roisin. Which deals with trauma. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you want us to learn from that experience?
Absolutely. You know, when I was writing the first half, even I would sometimes think, is it really as bad as this? Because it's very theoretical, very historical. And then I really was honored to interview 5 Jews from all around the world. And I just put a call out on Instagram. I was like, because does anyone want to speak to me for my next book? And Roisin, who is a Jewish woman from Wales, and her father is Jewish and her mother is Irish Catholic, which is where the name Roisin comes from, because that is a difficult name to pronounce, I know. And her story is really remarkable. Her great-grandfather was a survivor. Her grandfather was a survivor. But if I talk about her great-grandfather for a second, he worked for the German Jewish archives before the Nazis came into power. And then he was forced by the Nazis to travel the Reich and record the Jewish communities. So he became an active participant in the Shoah. He was the one kind of working out whether people were Jewish. Because remember, in Germany, Jews were very assimilated. So it was actually quite difficult to work out, is this person Jewish, is this person not Jewish? So that happened. Her grandfather was arrested on the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, so 84 years ago today, right? And he was arrested with 30,000 other Jewish men and boys over the age of 16. And he was sent to a concentration camp, and he escaped by hitting a Nazi over the head with a shovel and stealing his uniform. So they came to the UK, and they lost 90 members of their family. I mean, this is not something I can even possibly understand. And the way they dealt with the trauma was not by talking about it necessarily. It was not by embracing Jewish pride, embracing Jewish joy. It was cutting it off. And the father, her father, Roisin's father, said to Roisin, I'm not passing this down to you. But the thing that he didn't pass down was Jewishness. She had no relationship with her Jewishness. And that was a manifestation, an expression of this incredible intergenerational trauma which exists in our community. But one of our greatest tragedies is we don't talk about it. So she was experiencing this, and it took the summer of 2020, last year, the war between Israel and Hamas, to really kind of awaken her to what it meant to be a Jew. But she is catching up and is seeing, she's in therapy, trying to cope with the experiences of her family. And I mean, the trauma is immense in her life. It's absolutely tragic because this is something imposed onto us. These are not things inherent to our experience. The trauma is imposed onto us, and then we're left to deal with it. And often we don't have the capacity to, because it's too great. How do you deal with 90 members of your family being murdered? I don't know.
Yep, absolutely. Can we talk a little bit about America and Hollywood right now? Well, maybe you can share with the audience, you are about to meet with Netflix. Yeah. You've developed a test regarding the media. So I'll let you maybe address that.
So I'm a Scottish Jew, and we were never represented on TV because there was like 5 of us. So that would make no sense. And even in Britain, we were never represented. So I would always watch American TV. I'd watch Friends, Sex and the City, all these shows, and it was so exciting when Jews were represented. I loved it. And then I got a bit older and kind of a bit more critical, and I started doing this work, and I realized that so much of the representation in American media is damaging and is reductive, and it is rooted solely on Jewish stereotypes. It's very rare to see kind of whole characters in American TV that are Jews. And one of the biggest examples of this is Friends. You know, I'm 35, so I watched Friends and loved it and cried when it ended. And even now, like my partner and I put it on and we watch it for something in the background. And I do think it's objectively funny. But I do watch it and I say to my partner, I'm like, this is disgusting. This is racism. They talk about, or they racialize Jewish women. Janice is a racialized Jewish woman. Even Monica, when they go to the Bahamas in one of the later seasons, her hair poofs out. And she's this kind of like, you know, the stereotype of a Jewish woman. Let's look at Ross. David Schwimmer is an objectively handsome man. But he is framed as being this like weak, effeminate, almost like castrated Jewish guy who, it's a miracle that he's with Rachel. Whereas like, I mean, he's hot. Like it's not that weird. And it's the writers of Friends were Jewish. And that's really the problem. So for studios like Netflix, so I'm meeting with Netflix next week. I'm trying to get my days correct. I think on Tuesday maybe. Because I developed a test called the Tevye test to kind of rank or rate representation of Jews. And I don't know if anyone here has heard of the Bechdel test, which ranks representation of women. And the test basically asks, do 2 women have a conversation in a piece of media that's not about a man? And it's kind of shocking how little that happens. And I created this test with 6 questions that really looked into stereotypes and ideas of Jewish people. And I kind of identified, I call it the trichotomy of Jewish representation. And people like funny Jews, people like murder Jews, which obviously comes from Darrell Horn's People Love Dead Jews, but I've tweaked it a wee bit. And the last one is people don't like the Orthodox. Look at Unorthodox, that show. Did any of you see it on Netflix? It was really, did you see it? It was gross. Because that is a community that is dealing with its own trauma. You know, the Setmars have responded to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, by becoming even more observant. And I'm sure as a gay man, that is not a place I would want to spend any time. But I can understand why this community does what it does, and also understand the beauty in all of these communities, right? I've got to say, as a secular Jew, thank God for the Orthodox, because they're the ones really carrying on the traditions. But this show paints the Orthodox community as archaic and backwards and oppressive, and then unbelievably Germany, where this woman went in the show and in real life, Germany gets the redemption story. Germany becomes a place where Jews can go and live freely, and she can find who she truly is, and it's those nasty Jews that are the backwards ones. That is reinforcing stereotypes that have been around for hundreds of years. And that is what happens in media. And we have to be, and it's not to say that, don't watch Friends, whatever, I watch Friends. But we have to be critical, because so much of this we just accept. Like, oh, this is the way that Jews are treated or perceived. This is the way gay people, black people. We have to be questioning about it. And we have to advocate for ourselves and say, no, this isn't acceptable. We are more than just this experience you're representing.
There was a line in your book that really resonated with me, and you talked about how the fact that Jews, that we basically exist as an unbroken thread, and we are linked to people who existed thousands of years ago. And I'm wondering if you can also talk to identify this phenomenon of internalized Jew hate in terms of ancient historic Jewish communities, and then kind of what it's turned into.
So
it was
absolutely
all
right.
the word castration that led me to that question. Do you like that one?
So that's coming, guys. So right, we talk about this a lot. We are indigenous. We stretch back thousands of years. You can stretch your ancestry back to a crazy amount. And it's amazing, and it's exciting, and we know where we came from. Even if we convert, even if we join our peoplehood, we know where we came from as a concept. And because of that, internalized Jew hatred has always been a part of our experience, or at least has often been a part of our experience. And one of the first experiences that I identified was in Greek-ruled Judea. So the Jewish kingdom was the kingdom of Judah, then it became the kingdom of Judea when it was colonized, and the Greeks ruled it. And the Greeks did everything naked. They loved being naked. They did their sports naked, they did their schools naked. They went to gymnasiums, which I think literally means schools for naked exercise. And they thought that being circumcised was to be mutilated. And the Jewish men and boys were circumcised. So you have this really kind of unbelievable phenomenon where the Jewish men and boys in Greek-ruled Judea were trying to reverse their circumcisions 2,300 years ago. And they were doing that for a number of reasons. One is because it's a possibility that they had absorbed these ideas that to be circumcised is to be mutilated, because again, the power dynamic. But also, you couldn't join the gymnasium if you were circumcised. You couldn't go and do the naked exercise. You couldn't be in this place, which was also about getting ahead and business and talks. It was a place for socializing. So they did something really kind of outrageous back then. There wasn't the idea of atheist Jews. So the circumcision is meant to be a covenant from God, right? That is what it's written as. So these Jewish men and boys in the Jewish state, in the Jewish land, were reversing their circumcisions and essentially breaking this connection between them and their God. And that is I think that's a really kind of shocking example, but you have Jews who converted to Christianity, who then spent the rest of their times kind of like hating Jewish people and did immense amounts of damage. And even still, they were not accepted. There was one called Johannes Pfefferkorn from Germany in the 16th century, and he was always referred to by an enemy as Johannes the Baptized Jew, because that's what it was. Because he was a Jew, he couldn't escape it. We saw it in incredible amounts in Germany in the 19th century following the Enlightenment, because the world was opened up to the Jewish community, and they were offered this kind of choice of join us. But it wasn't, it wasn't just a lovely offer. They were given a contract which they were told to sign, and there was little terms and conditions at the bottom about what kind of palatable Jews would be accepted. And we see it all over the world today, particularly in North America, and I think really in the United States. And I think there is like a sliding scale. As Canadian Jews, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. The European Jews never felt like they were accepted. The British Jews felt like they were more accepted than the Europeans, but still not as accepted as the Americans. And then there were American Jews who felt very accepted. And I'd be very interested to see where Canada fits into that. And because of that perceived acceptance, people were willing to kind of, shed their Jewishness a wee bit. There was a famous Jewish historian called Howard Sachar, who is quoted in an article in the Los Angeles Times who says, yes, there's been an erosion of Jewish cultural life, but that's a small price to pay for the acceptance we've got in this country. Like, that's a really, pathetic thing to say, to be quite honest. Like, have a bit of self-respect. We should be accepted because we're human beings and we contribute to these countries and because we matter inherently. We don't need to endure this cultural erosion and then celebrate it like it's been giving us a gift from God. And then probably the last very prominent example is anti-Zionist Jews and Jews on the left who, again, disavow their Zionism, their connection with their indigenous land, to be accepted into these spaces, and that doesn't seem to be working either.
Or even today, earlier today, when you were talking about what it was like for, Dahlia and I related to this because of our ages, people were getting nose jobs. Jewish people were going for nose jobs. And you actually provided us with a little bit of background on that today, which I didn't know before.
So the modern nose job, I mean, there were kind of prototype nose jobs, but the modern nose job was invented by a German Jew called Jak Josef. I don't know how you would say that. And he did it to help people pass. And he was giving free nose jobs to Jews in the beginning of the 1930s to help them pass, to help them kind of escape this, to escape Nazism. And listen, people can do whatever they want with their bodies, right? Like, do what you want. But we have to consider it because there is a cultural narrative about Jewish people and how we look. So if we're going to get a nose job or any other kind of surgery, we have to really understand not only our own personal feelings, but how it relates to this wider conversation that again is imposed on us. These are not natural conversations for us to be having. They're conversations we have to have because of the relationship with the wider world.
So what's the solution to internalized racism for both Jews and non-Jews?
I think for everyone it's pride. You know, gay pride is a kind of more well-known movement that kind of is in the North America. It's said to have started in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. There's black pride from the 1970s with Black is Beautiful. And that is the answer. Because we need to build a wall, we need to build a defense system that protects us from these messages that are constantly bombarding us. If we think about how much, you know, we interact with the wider world and the messages we receive, it's very easy to absorb them. And most people do to an extent, across the board, right, across different communities. But the answer, the defense, I have identified anyway, is pride. Because pride is not just a feeling of like, I like myself. It's an understanding of your basic integrity as a human being and the idea that only we, whichever we that might be, gets to define our experience. So as Jews, only Jews get to define the Jewish experience. Only gay people get to define the LGBTQ, or LGBTQ plus people get to define the LGBTQ plus experience. And that was my problem as a kid. I had absorbed all of these awful ideas about what it meant to be a gay man. And it made me hate myself. And that's what we have to do. We have to build a barrier. We have to talk about things like our trauma, because they exist in our community, but we don't talk about it. We don't address it. It's not a public conversation, which means we suffer, but in silence. And I think it can be very tricky to open up the Pandora's box, right? And to say, actually, the countries that we've made our homes, they might not be as accepting as we once thought. And that is a difficult thing for us to come to terms with. But we have to come to terms with it. Because the thing that I always say is Jewishness does not belong to any of us. We are caretakers of it for the next generation. So we have to mend it, we have to beautify it, we have to evolve it, and then we pass it on. And if we're not doing our work as its current caretakers, what are we passing on to future generations?
And one of the things I really appreciated you sharing today, we had a session with students, was educate yourself. Just because we're born Jewish does not give us the knowledge of understanding who we are. And so when we're trying to have confidence and live proudly, we need to be able to understand who we are and communicate that.
Absolutely. I think we think that these are innate things that Jews must know. And I think sometimes we have innate knowledge or understanding of our experiences. And like, oh, that interaction we had was kind of a bit gross. But we might not understand why. I had to learn. I say to people, this is a real subject. People go to school to learn this. And not everyone needs to be an academic and write books, but each of us should have a basic understanding of our experience, an understanding of who we are. So the idea that we're an indigenous people, what does that mean to us? What does it mean to be a Middle Eastern diasporic community? What does that mean? We have to understand it. We have to understand our history and how we relate to each other, as you said, going back thousands of years. It's not innate, and we as a community have to do a much better job of educating. You know, I taught a class last year in Hong Kong, and sometimes when you're a teacher, you want to show them a video, and then you give them a piece of work, so you don't need to like teach a lesson. It's a teaching hack. And I was looking for videos on like the Jewish historical experience in the land of Israel, like thousands of years ago, and I couldn't find anything. All I could find were videos about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the Torah stories, and they're important, but that's not the perspective that I was teaching from. So how are we teaching these stories to our kids? Do we understand it? Do we understand that we're an indigenous people? What does that mean? It's not innate knowledge. We have to do better at educating, and education is the lifeblood of the Jewish people. It's how we have survived for thousands of years in Calgary, in Glasgow, in South Africa, everywhere. We're all still connected to one another. But that connection, we cannot take it for granted. It only takes a couple of generations for it to kind of disappear. And we have to educate. That's it. I mean, it's like basic, I think. I mean, it seems like an easy thing to do. I guess it's obviously very difficult, but that's the solution, I think.
Is this the same class that you started the class with saying you're about to tell them, that you're about to teach them the greatest story of all time?
Yes. So I was like, I know I'm biased, guys, but it really is. I mean, when you understand the Jewish experience and understand the twists and turns of our history, it's remarkable. And then the experiences of our civilization, because that's what we are. We're a civilization. The civilization in the land for 2,000 years. But then what were the diasporic Jewish communities doing? What about the Bet Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish communities, who had an independent kingdom called the Kingdom of Simeon, who had a Jewish queen, the Queen Judith? Or the Sephardic Jews, or the Jews in different parts of the Middle East or North Africa, or our ancestors, the Ashkenazi people. It's like, I mean, people are kind of rude about Ashkenazi food, but it's poverty food, and it's great. Because that's all they could afford, and they ate it, and it was amazing, and it sustained them. Like, that is what we are. We're survivors. All of these different communities. We're not victims. And people often like to view our history through a veil of tears and say, oh, the Holocaust, or the pogroms. It's very sad. It's like, yeah, of course it's sad. It's terrible. But we're more than what is done to us. We're more than these experiences. We are not victims. We're powerful, resilient survivors. And again, we have to teach ourselves that. It's not innate knowledge.
Ben, you spend a lot of time answering the question in terms of what's the solution from the perspective of Jews, Jewish pride, taking the time to educate ourselves. What about our non-Jewish audience? What's the solution for non-Jews?
So I think for non-Jewish people, it's about engaging in this subject without any shame. You know, when I talk about the non-Jewish world, I'm not talking about individual non-Jewish people. This is much bigger than Jews and non-Jews. And Jews and non-Jews live in the world, right? And we experience these messages. I think the thing that I would ask our non-Jewish friends and non-Jewish allies to do is just listen to us. Because they live in a world, we live in the same world often, that teaches specific things about Jewish experience, right? That we're just a religion, that anti-Semitism ended after the Holocaust. That is what the narrative is. So of course there are people who have absorbed it. That's not that surprising. So when you're speaking to a Jewish person, try to understand that you might not understand, and that's okay. There's many experiences that I don't understand, but it's about asking, it's about listening with humility, and to saying, can you tell me more about this? And not tokenizing. Now, that's a very difficult thing, right? Because I understand, like Marta Kaufman, who wrote Friends, is Jewish. So how is, I mean, this was obviously made a long time ago, but how is Netflix meant to understand that it might be anti-Jewish and the complication with that because of her Jewish identity? But we have to not tokenize people. We need to understand kind of greater trends in our community. So for example, Zionism. Like, I think 95% of the Jewish world identifies as Zionist, meaning they understand and believe in the Jewish right of self-determination or indigenous land. The New York Times, for some reason, it's like their fetish to talk about the chasm that exists in the Jewish world. The Jewish world is split. There's a chasm. Jews are disagreeing over Zionism. It's like, no, we're not, actually. Anti-Zionism is growing, and that's a problem, but we're pretty much agreed. So we have to also take kind of the majority perspective. It's like Kanye again, with his White Lives Matter t-shirts. That was, I'm sure, very useful to particular people. But that does not seem to be the perspective of the majority of the black community. So if you're going to engage in that conversation and understand the black experience, you have to be making sure that you're not tokenizing. You're not getting the useful black person or the useful Jew, because there are always Jews who will be useful. And I'm sure with regards to other communities too, right? Like Johannes Pfefferkorn. He loved it.
So what are 3 things that, if the audience could take away 3 things tonight about Jew hate, about Israel, what would you want them to be?
I can remember 2 of the ones that we discussed. You might need to prompt me. One is that we're indigenous to the land of Israel. And this was not something I really fully understood until quite recently. I knew that growing up in Scotland, I was different to the kind of non-Jewish Scottish kids at my school. And the story I always tell is Rosh Hashanah, like Jewish New Year. And it was a very stressful operation in my house. And my mum was like cooking for weeks at a time, and my dad wasn't doing very much, in all honesty. But the one job he had was to go out and get fruit. And he was always told, do not forget the pomegranate. And then when I was in Hong Kong, basically doing the same thing to my partner, which is how we become our parents, I was like, don't forget the pomegranate. And I was not eating in Scotland, we were not eating raspberries. And that is the indigenous fruit of Scotland. And Scottish raspberries are the best. We were eating pomegranate because that comes from the land of Israel. It's one of the Shivat Haminim, the seven fruit species. But I can only remember 6 of them, so I'm not going to quote them at you. And we are indigenous. It's not just that we originated in that land. We are rooted in the land. We shake lulav and etrog at Sukkot because of that's where it comes from, because of the land. We have a calendar. We celebrate New Year in September or October because of the land. So that's number one. The second I think I remember is we're not just a religious community. I find that to be honestly incredibly reductive. In the UK, they talk about faith. And I'm sometimes invited onto a TV show to talk about faith communities. And I start every single talk by saying, well, we're not just a faith community. And actually, the idea of faith doesn't really apply to us. We're not just a religious community. Religion, God, Hashem, is a part of our civilization, but it's not the only part. There's history, there's tradition, there's language, there's land, all of those things. Because I don't center God or Hashem in my Jewishness. So does that mean I'm no longer a Jew? Of course not. But again, we get to define our experience. And just to say very quickly, the idea that we're just a religious community came from France and laterally the United States in the 18th century. A French politician said in 1791, after the French Revolution, about the Jews, we will not have a nation within a nation. If the Jews want to be a nation, we will expel them. Because that is what we are. We're a nation. We're a civilization. So we adopted an identity which would be palatable, which would fit in with wider expectations. And we're not just a religious identity. We're not just a religious group, and that is incredibly important. And then the last point is, we're not tragedy. We have tragedy, and we need to be given the space to process these things, to talk about these things. But to be Jewish is a wonderful thing. It's an amazing thing that I'm a Scottish Jew sitting in Calgary in 2022 and we're discussing Jewish identity. That's bonkers because we shouldn't be here. But we have survived. And not only did we survive, you know, the Jewish thing is they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, which often is our festivals. But actually it's more than that. We thrived. Look at the Ethiopian Jewish culture. Look at the Mizrahi Jewish culture, so Jews in the Middle East or North Africa, Sephardic, Spain and Portugal, Ashkenazi Jews in Central and East Europe. Look at the cultures they created. Look how they remained rooted in their indigenous lands. It's a miracle. So when we talk about Jewish history, we have to underpin everything, even Holocaust education, with pride. Those who were taken from us, or were stolen from us during the Holocaust, they're more than just that experience. They were Jewish people living lives before this monstrosity took place. And again, it's about us defining our own experience and identity. So I would say, if I can remember, Jewish indigeneity, not just a religion, and we're not victims. They're the 3 things I remembered.
Well done. This evening was presented as a talk about the enemy from within and internalized Jew hate, but also on a general level. And one of the things that was talked about, and I think you might have an opinion, a strong opinion on, is, do Jews represent the canary in the coal mine on this topic?
You're right. I have very strong opinions about this. I have strong opinions about a lot of stuff. I hate the idea that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. I really despise it. And the reason I despise it is that it assigns us a role. That we exist solely to serve a role for the wider world. And what is that role? Well, what happens to the canary in the coal mine? If it dies, the gas is coming, right? Or whatever happens in coal mines. I don't know. That's what we're meant to represent. How awful is that? That we exist to serve a role that when things get bad for Jews, when Jews are murdered, that's when the non-Jewish world needs to be worried. The non-Jewish world should be worried because we're human beings. And our experience inherently matters, just like every other experience. But the idea that we matter because we serve this purpose, not only I find to be gross, but it's also, again, very Christian. It goes back to this Christian idea of Jews being assigned a role in the world. We do not exist to serve anyone. We do not exist to make other people's lives make sense. We exist because we exist, period. And I think that we should really move away from the idea that we're the canary in the coal mine. A lot of people say it, and it like bristles my neck whenever we do, because it's like, well, that's not why we're here. Yeah. We're here to serve a lesson, and then, okay, so what? The lesson is learned for about 5 seconds, let's be honest, and then the whole thing starts up again? No, we matter. period, that's it.
One of some of the comments from today, when we were talking to some of the students who were leaving, even some of the teachers who were part of a Jewish school that came, they left with pride. Many of them communicated that even the looks on their faces, I can't wait to get back to school and teach. I'm proud. And so the energy that you give off is really inspiring, and it's infectious. And so why, I know why you do it, but if you can talk to us a little bit, this is not easy. You know, we just talked about thousands of years of this anti-Semitism, Jew hate. It's an uphill battle. It's not going away. So why do you do this? Where do you find the energy to keep going?
It sounds really corny, but I really feel like it's my destiny. I worked in fashion for a brief period. I worked for Tom Ford, and I love fashion. But it was soulless, and it was like The Devil Wears Prada, so that wasn't fun. But I left very quickly because I was like, this is not for me. And before that, I had worked for Jewish organizations. I'd been a Holocaust educator. I'd taken trips to Poland. And I was like, trying something new. And I think this is the work I'm meant to do. I understand it in a way that I don't really understand anything else. You ask my partner, I can't count to save myself. I do my budgets, and it's like I get 3 different answers, and I'm using a calculator. I'm like inept in that field. I feel like it's what I'm meant to do. And also, I have this sense of justice and injustice. And like I realized as a young gay kid, what is being done to us is wrong. What is being said about us is wrong. It's unacceptable that Kanye West, who has more followers than there are Jews in the world, on one of his social media platforms, is saying what he's saying. Do you want some tea?
Thanks, I'm gonna go cough.
You know, that's it. It's unacceptable. So I don't know. It's work that I'm drawn to, and I love it. And I'm actually a bit of an introvert, which is weird to think. But in my work, I'm not. In my work, I'm an extrovert. It gives me energy. So, poor Marnie.
It's dry in here.
Yeah. So I don't know. Pride gives me strength. When people are saying awful things to me online, and when people are telling me that I should die, and and that's what happens. Not that irregularly. I'm like, no, I love being Jewish. And the words that I say, I won't repeat here because we're in polite company, but it's a variation of screw you. Like, you don't get to make me feel lesser. And that's true as a gay person, and it's true as a Jew. And I will not stand for the double standard in which Jews are treated. That I'm allowed to have pride as a gay person, and people are like, oh yeah, good for you, like, yeah, pride. But the minute I talk about Jewish pride, people are like, but let me tell you what it means to be a Jew. No, enough. We're not dealing with it anymore. So I don't know, it just seems, I mean, that's a really rubbish answer.
No.
I don't know why I do the work. It just seems to be something that I'm drawn to, and something that I enjoy. I mean, I love writing these books. You okay? Good.
I'll pass that back.
Which is good timing because we're supposed to take questions from people. Lots of good questions. One of the ones, sorry, my voice is going to come back slowly here. With Jew hate rising, hate crimes rising, ignorant influencers rising, what advice would you give to our politicians, to our policymakers, so that we can avoid a path towards another effort of Jewish extermination?
I would say listen to us, because they don't listen to us. We are told what our experience is, and they put out statements which really, like, essentially all lives matter the Jewish experience. Like, to be very clear, last May, Jews were being attacked on the streets of major cities all over the world. They drove envoys through London, through Los Angeles, through Toronto, through other cities in Canada, in Vienna, everywhere. And many politicians put out statements condemning anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, of course, Islamophobia is just as important, or anti-Muslim hatred, as I've heard that we should refer to it. It's just as important. But what we saw is it wasn't Muslim people being attacked on the streets of these major cities. There were Jews. And we're allowed to center ourselves. They should center us. We shouldn't all lives matter the Holocaust. It's kind of unbelievable with Holocaust Memorial Day how many politicians put out statements that don't even mention the word Jew. They don't even mention the word anti-Semitism. That is unacceptable. And that's what they need to say. They need to listen to us. They need to center us in our own experiences. We're not asking for more here. We're asking to be treated with respect. And that's why when we, as Jews or other minority groups, when we raise our voices, it's so important. we have to tell our own stories because the wider world, unfortunately, cannot be trusted to tell our stories or represent us. But we have to keep on going at them because they don't understand.
So, and just to remind our audiences, please type in any questions that you might have. Along that line on, how things are reported, we've got a question about Sarah Halimi. And before I even get you to dive into that, I'd like to see the audience raise your hand if you've heard the name Sarah Halimi. So a quarter, an eighth of our audience? Yeah.
So Sarah Halimi was a French Jewish woman. She was a former teacher, I believe, and she did other jobs. And she was living in an apartment, and she had suffered kind of an ongoing abuse campaign from a young Muslim man. And this was always dismissed. And eventually, he broke into her apartment, he stabbed her, and he threw her over her balcony. And what did the French authorities do? The French authorities did the same damn thing they did when Ilan Halimi was murdered. It's not Jew hatred. They said he was smoking marijuana. Listen, that's not, I know lots of people who smoke marijuana, they're not committing hate crimes. That's not what happens. This was a racially motivated hate crime, and his defense was that he was smoking weed and he had a mental break, and now he's in a psychiatric hospital. And they would not recognize that Sarah Halimi was murdered because she was a Jew. Just like Ilan Halimi. It was the same situation in the early 2000s. And he's not related to Sarah, but he was a young French boy who was kidnapped by a gang because they thought he would be rich, because he was a Jew. They tortured him beyond recognition and dumped his naked, mutilated body at the side of a road, and he died. He was murdered. And the French authorities said the same thing. The French seem to have a real problem with admitting and recognizing Jew hatred. There was another man called Jeremy Cohen. There was another woman called, I'm not going to say her name because I will butcher the pronunciation, but she was a Holocaust survivor. Who was murdered in her home not that long ago. This is happening at a not so infrequent rate. And again, what we see over and over and over again is a denial. No, this is this other thing. And it's not. We have to say what the situation is. We have to identify that these people were murdered because they were Jews in France in the 2000s.
And I think it's quite telling that the audience has not heard of her. It was not worthy of being reported in the media.
And that's the thing. Do we ever see Jewish attacks on the mainstream media? Very rarely. The attacks on Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn or in London never make the mainstream news. We talk about it, and we circulate, images on Instagram, and we tweet about it, and we write articles about it, but it stays in our community. And what does that lesson tell us? It tells us that the non-Jewish world doesn't care about us, that our lives don't have value. And that's why we have to reject these ideas. We do have value. Sarah Halimi matters. Sarah Halimi is important. And we need to remember her name because the wider world is very keen for these people to be forgotten. And it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous, and we should not accept it. And really what we have to be is just like dogs with bones. We're not being quiet. They want us to be quiet, and we're not being quiet. We'll say these people's names to honor their memories and to make sure that at least we remember who they are.
There's so many good questions coming in. How do we self-define what it means to be a Jew when the answer to that question is different in different communities, or does that question even matter?
It's such a good question, and they say 3 Jews, 5 opinions, right? I think that is a gross understatement. It's like 3 Jews, 35 opinions. And that is great and wonderful, but it can be a little frustrating. And I think what we have to do is define ourselves via our historical truth. So what does that mean? Understanding where we came from, understanding how that land has a relationship to our identities today and our kind of more recent ancestors. And then, of course, each of us gets to choose. But I see Jewishness as a huge buffet table. And there's shakshuka and hummus and chicken soup and matzah brai and chicken chop liver. Couldn't remember any more Jewish food there. And each of us will go up and choose something different from this table. Even if we're friends and we have similarities, we might choose 90% of the same things, and then we have one thing that's different. But we have to choose from the table. We can't be down the street at another restaurant, at another simcha, and choosing from that table. That's not how it works. We are a rule-driven society. There is text, there are values. This is a real tangible thing. And while, of course, we have the freedom to relate to that in our own way, It has to be from this kind of general pot of Jewishness. So for me, what I say is that we are a Middle Eastern, in the diaspora, we're a Middle Eastern diasporic community, and we're an indigenous people, and we're a civilization. And yeah, it's complicated because I've just said like 500 words, right? And you probably wanted like one word. It's very difficult to define us because we predate modern definitions of identity. Race, religion are new. That is, we came way before that. So that's why we have to understand who we are. And it's okay if we don't agree. That is our right as Jews to argue with one another. But we have to argue with one another from a perspective of knowledge. And that knowledge has to be seen through a Jewish lens, not looking to the wider world to say that we're just a religious community or whatever.
So we've got a question here around how something's changed. Before, sharing some type of anti-Semitic comment would have been on the fringe communities. You wouldn't hear it. Now it's becoming mainstream. Why is that?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think that we are moving further away from the Holocaust. And I think that the Holocaust poses something very complicated to the wider world. And my dad used to say to me, the non-Jewish world hates Jews. And I think he was right. But that doesn't mean the non-Jewish world, the system of oppression, wants 6 million Jews to be murdered, wants 1.5 million Jewish children to be murdered. That is a leap, right? That's a leap even for your kind of most hateful person. So after the Holocaust, the world had to contend with the guilt that they felt, and the guilt they felt to a community they did not like. So what we've seen, particularly with regards to Israel, is the narrative change. The dominant narrative is now Israel is a white, settler, colonial, imperialist, racist, Nazi state that commits apartheid and genocide. And that's a way to kind of invert the Holocaust and portray us as perpetrators and not to recognize our victimhood. And I think the reality is it's always been there. You know, when people say things like, oh, it's normalized again, well, I mean, the word again is a bit redundant. So let's say they say they say it's normalized. No, it's re-normalized. This period we had from the 1960s to kind of like the last, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that is the anomaly in Jewish history. We've never had acceptance like that. But what we're learning now is that acceptance was not real acceptance. I mean, look at the American Jewish situation. There is trauma there in the recognition that things were not the way they thought they were. You know, for British Jews, when Corbyn was happening, our jaws were on the floor. But we pray for the Queen. Like, what are you talking about? This is from the center of the British establishment. Didn't matter. This is the dominant narrative because no one really has made any real effort to solve the problem because they don't understand it. So I think we've just returned to norm. Israel has been framed in a certain way, and moving further away from the Holocaust gives people license. And as the Holocaust becomes, for many people, kind of a distant memory, obviously not for us, that is, again, they can say what they want about us. They don't feel guilty anymore.
How can we respond to the fact that Jews are overrepresented? 0.2% of the population represents hugely disproportionate amounts of wealth and power. Conspiracy theorists are using that, as they always have, to demonize us.
So I would say there is poverty in our community. There's real poverty in our community. You know, my family growing up depended on Jewish social services, like Jewish care, to get by. And that was in Glasgow, which was a fairly affluent community. So I don't think we should overstate ideas of Jewish wealth. And then I think when we do talk about Jewish wealth, we should celebrate it. Because what a bloody miracle. After everything that was stolen from us, I mean, literally, I cannot even count the amount of money that would be stolen from us over the millennia. And even in the more recent past. I mean, look what was stolen from the Mizrahi Jews who were thrown out of, the North African and Middle Eastern countries. Trillions of dollars. We should celebrate intergenerational wealth if we are able to have it. We should celebrate success because it's a miracle. And yes, like with Kanye, they say, oh, we shouldn't talk about it because we'll prove him right when he gets cancelled. No, enough. They hate us if we're loud. They hate us if we're quiet. They hate us if we're rich. They hate us if we're poor. Who cares? We're not defining ourselves via their experience. We should celebrate Jewish wealth. We should celebrate Jewish success because it is a miracle. 25% of Nobel Prize winners being Jewish, that's a bloody miracle. It's astonishing, and it's because we work hard and because we're committed to education. It's not because we're better than other people. We're not. We're just the same, but we work hard. And other communities also work hard. And every community that has been minoritized and oppressed should be able to celebrate and address and recognize success. So we shouldn't care. They're going to hate us anyway. Us talking about Kanye is not going to make them hate us. Us, having an Hermes Birkin, do you know what that is? It's a handbag, is not going to make people hate us. They're going to hate us anyway. So wear your Birkin. And let's talk shit about Kanye, because it's unacceptable. We're not going to be quiet. We're not keeping our heads down. You would never, ever expect another community to do this. We talk about the pink pound, by the way. We call it dinks, double income, no kids. Those are often gay couples. And we celebrate it and we love it. No one's talking to us about that. And of course, there's not the historical precedent. But we shouldn't allow the wider world to shame us, because that's what these ideas do.
Thank you. Can we criticize Israel without it being Jew hate, anti-Semitic?
Yes, of course we can. And I'm sure if we were sitting around a table, we would have many different opinions about Israel. Some of them good, many of them probably not so good. Israel is a country like any other. And just like Canada, just like the United States, just like Britain, you should be able to criticize the Israeli government policy. I'm sure many of us have thoughts about this new government and the fact that Bibi Netanyahu seems to be the eternal prime minister. I'm not happy about that. I'm not happy that there are real homophobes in this administration. But I do not doubt Israel's right to exist. Israel's right to exist is not rooted in our perception of its morality. And this is a sucky situation because of the 2,000 years of hate, when one wants to criticize Israel, you have to do so responsibly, even us as Jews, because it's very easy for us to accidentally slide into Jew hatred. It's even like when we were talking about earlier, how do we address Jew hatred which comes from other minoritized communities? We have to do so very carefully so as not to slide into other forms of hate, because it can be easy, because these are the narratives that surround us. So when we criticize Israel, we have to do so responsibly. And Natan Sharansky, who is a Soviet Jewish refusenik, he became a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, he created the 3D test. And it was, you have to ask yourself about a statement or a poster or whatever the case may be. Does it demonize Israel? Does it delegitimize Israel? And does it treat it with double standards? And if it doesn't do those things, even if it's harsh criticism, and even if I might not like it, it isn't necessarily Jew hatred. We should be able to have nuanced conversations about Israeli government policy. The problem is, so often the conversation is not nuanced, and it's really rooted in the destruction of the Jewish state and the delegitimization of the Jewish right to self-determination in our land. So yes, we should criticize Israel, but let's do it responsibly.
What's your opinion of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel? Do you feel it's Jew-face, and can non-Jews play Jewish characters?
Controversial question. My personal opinion, and whenever I talk about this on Twitter, people come for me hard and call me very horrible names, so please don't do that if you disagree. I think that if other minoritized groups are able to play themselves in media, i.e., the black community playing the black community, trans community playing the trans community, gay people playing gay people, etc., then I think that should also apply to Jews. And I don't understand why it wouldn't. And I think it makes Jews so unbelievably uncomfortable, which is all those people who come for me online, because it reminds people that we're different. If we're saying, actually, I would like, who's a Jewish actress? Barbara Streisand, let's say, to play Golda Meir. That's reminding the world that we are not part of the white majority. We're part of a very specific community. And I know not a lot of people agree with me on that, and that's totally fine. With regards to Mrs. Maisel, or Maisel, how do you say it?
Maisel.
Maisel, okay. That
How
might
do
be
you
another
say it?
Maisel. But that might be wrong. Yeah, I think that it is kind of Jew-face. And I write about it in the new book, and it has been referred to as like caricature and the kind of, what's the word, like the reinforcement of stereotypes. It's like when James Corden, we all have heard of and hate James Corden, right? James Corden was in that, he's terrible, was in that really awful film Prom. And he plays a gay man and was nominated for a Golden Globe for some reason. And it's just a caricature. It's kind of like an uncomfortable, like, straight man being like, this is what it means to be a gay man. I think that is what can happen when non-Jewish people sometimes play Jews, and not always. Sometimes we can get beautiful portrayals. But let's look at Bradley Cooper playing Leonard Bernstein. Did anyone see the nose they made him wear? That's literal racism. Taking a physical feature that is supposedly common to Jewish people and putting a prosthetic nose on a non-Jewish actor. We have to be very careful in those situations. And again, if other communities have the right to play themselves, and I don't see why we wouldn't. It doesn't make any sense to me. So sorry if you love Mrs. Maisel.
I love the clothes on Mrs.
Okay.
Maisel and the music.
Well, that's okay. I'm sure the clothes are great. And again, there can be value, right? It's not like we need to say, we're never watching that show again. We're never watching Friends. We can watch these shows. We maybe just have to have a little bit more critical eye sometimes. You don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater all the time.
So, what is your third and final book of your trilogy going to be about?
Spoiler. It is going to be a book about Jewish indigeneity. So it's going to be an exploration of the Jews as an indigenous people, and most likely using the United Nations criteria. They have 7 criteria. 6 of them are great, and they really fit us, and one of them is just rubbish and is weird for any community, so I will be arguing against that. But I think that is, for me, this movement and these books are about helping Jews understand themselves better. And that, to me, is kind of the culmination of this. I really see us as an indigenous people, as in the diaspora, a Middle Eastern diasporic community, as a specific civilization. And I think that that is something that we should discuss and we should teach, and it should be a talking point in our community. So that'll be the third. And then I'm just going to tell you the fourth and fifth because I'm on a roll. The fourth is going to be a children's book about Jewish pride. So right now the working title is Jewish Pride for Kids, which is not very imaginative. And the fifth book is going to be a book about recentering the Holocaust as a Jewish experience, because I have been a Holocaust educator for 15 years, and I think the Holocaust has been stolen from us. And again, like people writing tweets on Holocaust Memorial Day that don't mention the word Jews, it's astonishing the number of articles that talk about the Holocaust and don't mention the word Jew, Jewish, Judaism, anti-Semitism, or Jew hate. So, and I think that is appalling. We get to define our experience, the good and the bad, and no one gets to tell us what it means to be a Jew or what that means as we navigate the world. Wow. So that's it.
Wow.
There's a number of questions that have come in about Kanye again, so I'm going to try to sum it up. I think the best way I can do this is this. There's actually quite a lot in common that Jewish people and Black people could probably get together and talk about, and support each other on. And maybe could you talk about that in terms of the history between what we could be getting along about and how we've supported each other?
Yeah, there has been a very close relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community. And of course, it's important to recognize that there are Black Jews. There's Black Jews living in North America and, of course, Ethiopian Jews, right? So we can't always talk about these two communities as being totally separate, because there are people who intersect both of these identities. But absolutely, there has been a historically close relationship. The Jews who were fleeing pogroms, so my family, Black people in the United States raised money for them. Like, that's astonishing. Obviously, the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement has been well documented, and there has been a close relationship. And what we've seen in some ways is a manipulation of this relationship by bad faith actors. So what we've seen, or how we've seen that manifest, is with regards to Israel and the Palestinians. Israel has become white, and the Palestinians have become Black or people of color, even though there's no genetic or racial distinction between Israelis and Palestinians at all. And that comes about from the Soviet Union. And this is what we have to understand, and I don't want to scare people, but there are bad faith actors manipulating the world as we speak. And these ideas are not necessarily organic. The Christian church spread them for a particular reason. The Nazis spread them, so the Soviet Union spread them, and a state like Qatar is spreading them today. And the Soviet Union spread the idea that Israel was this white colonial entity at a time when the left was turning away from the idea of class struggle as its raison d'etre. Decolonization was happening after the Second World War, and identity politics and decolonization became the kind of primary focus of the left. So, by framing Israel as a white colonial state, that put Israel and the Jews in opposition to these other communities who they previously stood with. And what we have to do is we have to not insult each other through racism of low expectations. Minoritized groups can be prejudiced. There is this idea that we're not. Gay people can be racist. Black people can be racist. Jews can be racist, right? We need to address these problems in our community, and we should call it out when they exist in other communities. But we have to do so without sliding into prejudice ourselves, like I said previously. And then also we have to do so in the spirit of togetherness. Because, it's a real problem, divide and conquer. The Black community and the Jewish community have been the main targets of white supremacy. And sometimes we lose sight of that, and we can turn on each other. And yeah, Kanye has to be called out. What Kanye is doing is incredibly dangerous, and there's literally millions of people watching him and agreeing with him, and that's unacceptable. So we should call Kanye out and not excuse him because of his mental health issues, which seems extraordinarily ableist, and then also not excuse him because he's a black guy. You know, he is able to be just as good and bad as any other person. So we have to treat each other as whole human beings and come together to understand our similarities and, of course, our differences, because there are differences, and that's fine. But yes, and the similarities, because there are many, and that's important.
So the term anti-Semitism is something that we understand, but you have an interesting perspective on it. You like to use Jew hate in place of it. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, I don't use anti-Semitism in the book once unless I'm quoting someone else. And I said it tonight, actually, which is incredibly rare. Like in our conversations, I say Jew hatred or anti-Jewish racism. We have to look at where the word came from. Anti-Semitism came from Germany in the 19th century. It was coined in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr, and it was to replace the historic Judenhass, which was Jew hatred. And what he was doing was creating a league of anti-Semites. That's what he wanted to do because he was proud of being a Jew hater. So this word was constructed to legitimize Jew hatred. Because let's think of the other ideologies that were created in the 19th century. Socialism, capitalism, liberalism, any of these things. Anti-Semitism. What he was trying to do was position it as a legitimate ideology. And if we pick the word apart and look at the middle section, the Semitic section, in Germany at that time, there was a huge emphasis on language as a sign of belonging. And there were Jews, there's anecdotes of Jews being unmasked as Jews, even if they spoke German fluently, because they had an accent, because they would have spoken Hebrew or Yiddish kind of at home or when they were a child. So language was a huge sign of belonging. So what Wilhelm Marr did was take this idea of Semitic languages. So there are no Semitic people. There are Semitic languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Amharic, Arabic. It's a collection of Southwest Asian, North African languages. And what he did was said, well, if people speak those languages, i.e. the Jews, if they speak Hebrew, then we can infer certain things about their biology. Right. So this was a word that was created not only to legitimize hatred of Jews, but to further embed racism. And, you know, some people disagree and some people use it because that is the word that is used. But I think pride is about taking ownership of our experience. And I don't really want to use a word to describe our experience that was created by this guy who wanted to legitimize his hatred of us. That just, again, it doesn't really make any sense to me.
Yeah. There have been a number of incidents in Calgary the last little bit. Recently, a student at a local high school played Nazi marching music in a school gym. At a Stand With Israel booth, someone there was vocally abused on a university campus. Considering that this is the reality that we're facing here in Calgary, how do we empower our youth to respond to Jew hate?
So I think what we have to first of all do is understand that Jew hatred is not a Jewish problem. Jew hatred is a non-Jewish problem. Homophobia is a straight problem. Misogyny is not a female problem, right? It's a male problem. So we have to understand those things. And then when we understand that, you say, okay, well, what is our work here? The work is pride. We need to give these students, these young people, self-esteem, self-confidence to withstand. So they know who they are, so they're educated. And yes, if they feel able to, they can debate, they can argue. But again, with boundaries. They're not debating their experience. They can debate policy or instances, whatever. But we have to give them pride so that they're not going to college and they're not being radicalized. Because let's be honest, that is what's happening on college campuses and on high school campuses as well. Young Jewish students and non-Jewish students are being radicalized. So we have to give them confidence and say, no, you get to define your identity. You get to understand your experience. And you have to do the work to do that. But when you go to these places, it's not realistic to say that a young Jewish person can fight the Jew hatred. I went to Glasgow University and it was a hellhole. And I fought every day and I didn't really make a dent.
Yeah.
But I fought and I was there. And I was there as a proud Jew because even though I was getting abused by my professors and my peers, I knew in my heart that I was a Jew and I was proud of being a Jew. And there was nothing these people could say to make me feel any different. And that may seem a bit trite, but I do think that is the answer. It's certainly the answer to internalized anti-Jewishness at the very least.
Yeah. You want to do one more question?
Yeah, so we have a question, just going back to some of your comments around Jews being perceived as just a religion. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I hate that. I really hate that. It really bothers me. And it came about in the 19th century, as I said. So Jews were in France, and the French-Jewish relationship had been enormously complicated. We were chucked out, they let us back in, then they chucked us out again, and there were pogroms, and there was abuses, and there was murder, blood libel, lots of terrible things. So when the French Revolution happened, and when this new shiny world was created, and the Jews were given this terms and conditions that you cannot be a nation, many accepted it. And then look what happened, right? There was a period of French Jewish history where Jews could assimilate. Dreyfus could join the army and become a captain. But what happened to Dreyfus? This Jewish French captain was accused of selling secrets to the Germans, and he was framed. And instead of shouting, hang the traitor, kill the traitor, they shouted, hang the Jew. So this is what happens when we absorb non-Jewish perceptions of our identities. And similarly, I will say very quickly, because you're standing up to finish. Okay. Let's look at the US. The Jews who were going to the US were fleeing genocide. That is what the pogroms were. They were genocide. And even earlier, the German Jews were fleeing genocide because Levi Strauss went to the United States because there was a law in Germany which said only the eldest son can get married. That is a law that restricts birth rates. That is a form of genocide. So they went to this land, and there was a Bill of Rights in place. They wanted to get ahead. They wanted to escape the trauma and the horrendous experiences of the past. So the Bill of Rights guarantees religious freedom. So they leant into it. Yeah. And then after the war, for some reason, Judaism, Catholicism, and Protestantism were kind of referred to as the three main American religions. Yeah. So that gave Jews permission to be actively Jewish in a very specific context. And what do we see now? Religion is dying in the United States. So now we're seeing Jews who are Jews without religion. And I'm a secular Jew, but my religion is still Judaism. You can't really divorce it. It's just like Zionism, right? You can't really divorce these things. So that is this idea that we're just a religion, and it's not true. But we have to get through layers and layers of conditioning to understand that and to convince the people around us. And like, am I being played off? I thought I heard music there, like at the Golden Globes.
Almost,
like,
almost.
Do.
Thank you. We always learn something new from you. And you've given specifically Delia and I the confidence and the education so that we can go out and steal a lot of your ideas and share them with other people. So thanks for that. I also want to thank you because in answer to that question about our Jewish youth specifically, Ben is hanging out with a number of our Hillel BBYO kids tomorrow night at the Beth Synagogue to teach our kids how to respond to the issues that we know that they're facing on campuses and in high school, and to teach them to talk with boundaries, which is key for us. And the other group we want to thank, just for a moment here, and use Stephen as our leader here, is we just really want to thank the Calgary Public Library. What has become more and more apparent as we've done these programs for the last 2 years is that we have an incredible partner, a partner that's willing to provide a safe space for us to talk about these very difficult topics sometimes. And Stephen specifically, Stephen Dolman, who has some closing remarks for us now, we just want to say a big thank you.
I'm very rarely in this position. I'm usually behind the scenes, so this is an honor to speak to all of you tonight and to hear Ben speak for the third time. First one was virtually last January, and the last couple of years have been a true pleasure to get to know Marnie and Dahlia, and of course Ben virtually at first and now in person. So thanks for letting me steal the podium just for a few minutes of your time. I'm the Events and Program Partnership Lead at Calgary Public Library, and the best part of my job and my colleague Carolyn's job is that we get to work with community partners to create experiences like this for Calgary, and is a job that never runs out of wonderful ideas. Once again, our program tonight was made possible through a unique partnership with several different groups: the Calgary Jewish Federation, their Holocaust and Human Rights Commemoration and Education Department, Edmonton Public Library, the Jewish Federation of Edmonton, as well as generous sponsorship by the Isadore and Florence Burstyn Memorial Fund for Human Rights and Holocaust Awareness, KSW Calgary Holocaust Education and Commemoration Endowment Fund, Viewpoint Foundation, and of course the Human Rights and Holocaust Education Fund at the Calgary Public Library Foundation. I can't give enough words to thank Marnie and Dahlia for all the work they do as volunteers behind the scenes to make these experiences possible, virtually and in person, so thank you very much. And once again, on behalf of the library, a huge thank you to Ben for coming all this way and experiencing weather shock in Calgary. And we're telling him it's not that cold because it's only -7. He disagrees. It has been a true pleasure. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being with us here tonight. Once again, check out our website, calgarylibrary.ca, for future programs. We'd love to see you back in person or virtually. Thanks again for being here.
And we have copies of his second book for sale at the back for $25. There's a limited amount, and he'll sign them. Thanks, everyone, for coming.